Hi everyone! This is the second part of my Ukrainian office desk. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made the tabletop part of the desk. If you want to see how I made the base, check out part 1. First, I had to make a mold for the pour. To do this, I used melamine boards, and due to the size of the tabletops, I had to put 2 pieces of melamine together. I used a scrap piece of board to provide support for the seam and used a lot of caulking to make the seams waterproof. Then I cleaned up the edges and the rotted parts of the wood slabs. I tried a few different things to clean up the edges, but ultimately I found that the sander with low grit sandpaper worked best for this. As for the inside areas of the wood, this took a lot of chiseling and cleaning. This particular slab had a lot of rot in the middle, which I thought looked really unique, but it was really time-consuming to clean. I ended up mostly using a chisel and my Dremel to clean this. Now it's really important to get rid of all of the dry and rotted pieces, otherwise they can fall off or detach after the epoxy pour, and they can weaken those areas where the epoxy meets the wood. After my wood was cleaned up, I cut the sides of my molds using a circular saw and the Kreg rip cut jig. I then cut the sides to size using a miter saw. For the long sides, I glued 2 side pieces together with a scrap board on the outside for added support. Then it was time to cut my slab. Since I don't have a track long enough for the length of this table, I used a laser level to get a perfectly straight edge and shifted my track until the cut was done. I drilled holes along the bottom of my mold where the sides would attach to the bottom. I used a little CA glue to hold down the sides in place while I lifted the board and drilled in my screws. After the sides were attached, I put silicone along the inside and outside of my mold. I then used mold release on the entire inside of the mold. Since this table is so large and heavy, I left one side detached, which allowed me to shim the slab into the mold. Once the slab was where I wanted it, I attached the final side, making sure to use a lot of caulking on the inside and outside. I clamped some scrap boards along the top of the slabs to hold the wood in place during my pour. I wanted the bottom of the table to be black to really allow the flowers to pop, so I mixed some black dye into my epoxy. My wood has a lot of tiny holes and cracks in it, so I decided to use a syringe for this first layer, thinking that it would keep the tabletop cleaner. However, this ended up making a big mess on the top of the slab anyway, so I'm sure using a cup here would have worked just as well and could have saved me a lot of time. After the first layer, I removed the clamps and scrap boards since the epoxy would be stuck to the bottom from that first layer. This allowed me to have more space to arrange my flowers. Now the next step is the most fun. I placed my blue and yellow dried flowers into the epoxy, and it's really important to use completely dry flowers, otherwise they can rot in the epoxy and not set properly. When you're doing a lot of layers of epoxy like this, it's important to either do subsequent pours while the prior layer is still tacky, or to use sandpaper to roughen the surface and create a strong bond between the old and new layers. I didn't want to use sandpaper, especially with some of these small imperfections, so I checked on the epoxy until it was just tacky enough for my next pour. I also didn't want the epoxy that got on the sides to harden, so with each pour I used a paintbrush to paint all of the edges with a fresh coat of epoxy. I then mixed up more epoxy. This time I didn't add any dye to it. I used a syringe to add a layer of clear epoxy on top of the flowers. Again, I'm using really thin layers so that the flowers don't float onto the top of the table, and also to prevent creating an overly thick pour, which has a higher chance of overheating and discoloring the flowers. I then removed the sides of the mold and flipped the table to get the bottom of the mold off as well. Unfortunately, demolding the bottom took several people, and in the mix of all the excitement, I forgot to film that step. I flattened the slabs using this router sled that I built. I first flattened one side, and then I flipped the table to do the other side. I cut the sides of the table to width and cut the ends of the corner pieces at 45-degree angles for a miter joint. Next, I used my domino to create slots in the miter end where the domino connectors will go. I then inserted the connectors and dominoes and assembled the three pieces of desk together. Once everything was assembled, it was time to sand. I used black CA glue to fill any tiny holes and sanded the table up to 180 grit. With Rubio Monocoat, you're only supposed to sand to about 180 grit, which is not nearly fine enough to remove the scratches and haziness from the epoxy. Now I could have sanded everything to a fine grit and then roughened the surface of the wood sections, but I decided to use a different technique instead. I sanded everything to 180 and then I used a fine paintbrush to paint a thin, fresh layer of epoxy onto the epoxy pieces. Next, it was time to do the doors. For this, I used inset bloom hinges and a correct jig to attach the hinges to the door. I then measured and drilled holes in the legs for the mounting plates, following the instructions on the Bloom website. I placed a scrap piece of board along the beam to catch the doors. I found these cool gold handles online that I thought matched perfectly with the yellow flowers, so I attached those to the doors. Then I cleaned the entire table with mineral spirits and applied my Rubio. I had to clean up the Rubio really well from the epoxy sections to prevent it from drying on the epoxy. There were actually some sections that I didn't clean very well, and I had to go back and resand those and reapply the epoxy with a paintbrush. And here's the finished product. Let me know what you guys think. I also used scrap pieces of wood for the art and shelf on the walls, so stay tuned if you want more videos on those. Bye everyone, and Slava Україні!